It's funny how one little piece of paper can change everything. I mean, who would have thought that a simple letter could turn my quiet life upside down? That's exactly what happened to me on an ordinary Tuesday evening. I had just come home after a long day at work. The sun was setting, casting this warm orange glow over the neighborhood. Maplewood Lane looked as picture-perfect as always. Neat lawns, trimmed hedges, and those cute little welcome mats outside each door. It was the kind of place where you expected kids to play catch in the streets and neighbors to wave hello every morning. Or so I thought. When I got to my front door, something caught my eye. A white envelope taped neatly to the wood. At first glance, it seemed harmless enough, maybe even official looking. But when I opened it, I felt my stomach drop. Inside was a letter from the Homeowners Association, HOA, signed by none other than Mrs. Patricia Langley herself. If you've ever met someone who takes rules way too seriously, then you already know what she's like. She's the type of person who probably irons her clothes twice before wearing them. The letter wasn't friendly or polite. It was cold and direct. Apparently, my trusty old pickup truck, which I'd parked in my driveway overnight, was now considered unsightly. Yes, unsightly. According to Section 9C of the HOA Handbook, a book I didn't even know existed until that moment. Vehicles visible from the street needed to be aesthetically pleasing and maintained in showroom condition. Showroom condition? Seriously. Let me tell you something about that truck. It wasn't some junker sitting around collecting rust. It was reliable, sturdy, and had been with me through thick and thin. It helped me move into this house 2 years ago, pulled me out of snowbanks during winter storms, and hauled furniture for half the neighborhood whenever someone needed help. And yeah, sure, it had its share of dents and scratches, but those weren't flaws. They were stories. Stories of hard work, adventures, and memories. So, to call it unsightly felt personal, like they weren't just criticizing my truck, but also everything it represented. I stood there staring at the letter, feeling anger bubble up inside me. Who did these people think they were? This wasn't just a rule. It felt like an attack on my freedom, my choices, and my right to live the way I wanted within my own property. I crumpled the letter into a tight ball and threw it across the room. Then I slumped onto the couch, running my hands through my hair. Was this really happening? Did they honestly expect me to replace my perfectly good truck with something shiny and expensive just because it fit their idea of beauty? What was next? Would they send me a memo telling me what color shirt to wear while mowing the lawn? As I sat there fuming, an odd sense of determination started creeping in. They might have the power to write letters and enforce rules, but I wasn't going to let them win without a fight. Something inside me clicked, and I decided then and there that I wouldn't back down. Not this time. Little did I know, that decision would set off a chain reaction I never saw coming. The next morning, I woke up with a plan forming in my mind. It wasn't fully fleshed out yet, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going to let the HOA push me around without putting up a fight. So after grabbing a cup of coffee and steeling myself for what lay ahead, I marched over to Mrs. Langley's house. If anyone could explain this ridiculous rule about my truck, it would be her. Her house was just as pristine as you'd expect. Perfectly symmetrical flower beds, freshly painted shutters, and a welcome mat that looked like it had never actually welcomed anyone. I rang the doorbell, and within seconds, she appeared. Of course, she was dressed impeccably, wearing her signature pearls and a pastel cardigan that matched the color scheme of her living room. In her hands was a clipboard, which seemed permanently attached to her like an extra limb. "Mrs. Langley," I said, forcing a polite smile even though I felt anything but calm. "I got your letter about my truck." She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable, but somehow still intimidating. Yes," she replied, her voice smooth and measured. "I'm glad you brought this up. We simply want to ensure that our community maintains its high standards." "High standards," I repeated, trying to keep my tone light, despite the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "You're saying my truck is ruining the look of the neighborhood?" Well, she hesitated for a moment, then continued, her voice taking on a sharper edge. It's not exactly cohesive with the rest of the community. Our guidelines exist to preserve property values and create a harmonious environment for everyone. I stared at her, dumbfounded. Cohesive? Harmonious? Was she serious right now? The irony hit me hard. Here, we were in a neighborhood full of cookie-cutter houses where every lawn looked identical, and she was lecturing me about harmony. It felt like they weren't preserving individuality. They were stamping it out. But arguing with her wasn't going to solve anything. She thrived on rules and order, and no amount of logic or emotion was going to change her mind. Instead, I decided to play along for now. Smiling sweetly, I said, "Don't worry, Mrs. Langley. I'll take care of it." Her expression softened slightly, clearly pleased that I seemed compliant. "Thank you for understanding," she said, giving me a tight-lipped smile before closing the door. As I walked back home, my mind raced. Take care of it. Oh, I would, but not in the way she expected. By the time I reached my driveway, an idea had started taking shape. What if I gave them exactly what they wanted, but turned it into something absurd? Something so outrageous that it would expose how ridiculous their rules really were. That's when inspiration struck. A tank. Yes, a real, honest-to-goodness military tank parked smack dab in the middle of my front yard. Why not? If they thought my truck was unsightly, imagine how they'd react to *that*. Over the next couple of days, I made some calls and pulled a few strings. Renting a tank wasn't cheap, but sometimes you have to spend money to make a point. When the day finally came, I stood on my porch watching as the massive machine rolled onto my lawn. Its treads crushed the grass, its turret gleamed in the sunlight, and its sheer size dwarfed everything around it, including Mrs. Langley's prized hydrangeas next door. Neighbors began pouring out of their houses, mouths agape, phones raised to capture the spectacle. Kids ran toward the tank like moths to a flame, climbing all over it while their parents looked on in disbelief. And then there was Mrs. Langley, standing frozen at the edge of the crowd, her face pale and her clipboard trembling in her hands. This is completely unacceptable," she stammered when she finally found her voice. I couldn't help but grin. "Oh, come on, Mrs. Langley. Isn't it beautiful? Much more aesthetically pleasing than my old truck, don't you think?" Her glare could have melted steel, but I didn't care. This was only the beginning. The tank became the talk of the neighborhood almost instantly. You'd think a circus had rolled into town, given how everyone reacted. Kids treated it like their new favorite playground, scrambling up its treads and pretending to steer it like little generals. Parents stood nearby, snapping photos and shaking their heads, some in amusement, others in disbelief. Even Mr. Thompson, the elderly man who always kept to himself, shuffled over with his cane just to get a closer look. He chuckled softly and muttered, "Well, I'll be darned." But not everyone was amused. Mrs. Langley looked like she'd swallowed something sour. She marched up to me, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement, her face pale but her eyes blazing. "What is *that* doing here?" she demanded, pointing at the hulking metal beast on my lawn. I shrugged casually, as if having a military tank parked outside my house was the most normal thing in the world. "Oh, this." I gestured toward the tank like it was no big deal. Since my truck isn't allowed in the driveway, I figured I'd park something more aesthetically pleasing. "Isn't it beautiful?" Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. For once, she seemed completely speechless. Finally, she managed to sputter, "This is completely unacceptable." "Why?" I asked innocently, tilting my head as though I genuinely didn't understand her outrage. "It's not in the driveway, and it's definitely unique. Isn't that what we're aiming for around here? Originality." Her nostrils flared, and her grip tightened on her clipboard so hard I thought it might snap in half. But she couldn't argue, not without contradicting her own precious rules. After all, Nowhere in the HOA handbook did it say anything about tanks being banned from front yards. That was the beauty of it. I hadn't broken any specific rule. I'd simply taken their obsession with appearances to its logical extreme. As word spread, people started showing up just to see the spectacle. Neighbors brought snacks and drinks, turning my yard into an impromptu gathering spot. Some folks even joked about hosting block parties or movie nights using the tank as a projector screen. It was surreal and kind of wonderful. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. A few neighbors avoided eye contact when they passed by, muttering under their breath about property values and setting a bad example. One guy across the street glared at me every time he pulled into his driveway, clearly annoyed that his shiny sedan now had to compete with 30 tons of steel for attention. And then there were the anonymous notes that started appearing in my mailbox again. Asterisk remove the eyesore, asterisk one read. Another simply said, asterisk you're ruining this place, asterisk. But the funny thing was, I didn't feel intimidated anymore. If anything, I felt empowered. Watching Mrs. Langley squirm was oddly satisfying. Every time she walked past my house, she shot daggers at me with her eyes, but I just smiled back sweetly. The tank wasn't just a statement, it was a test. How far would they go to enforce their rules? Would they dig deeper into their handbook to find some obscure clause about military vehicles, or would they admit defeat and leave me alone? The tension simmered for days. The HOA called an emergency meeting, which I attended with popcorn in hand, ready to watch the chaos unfold. Mrs. Langley paced the room like a caged animal, clutching her clipboard like it was a lifeline. This asterisk monstrosity asterisk is destroying our community, she exclaimed, waving her arms dramatically. We cannot allow such blatant disregard for our guidelines. But not everyone agreed. Mr. Thompson spoke up first, his voice steady despite his age. Frankly, I think it's refreshing, he said, earning a collective gasp from the crowd. At least someone's standing up to this nonsense. Others chimed in, voicing frustrations they'd kept bottled up for years. Sarah, the young mom 2 doors down, admitted she hated the constant nitpicking over flower colors and mailbox designs. Even Mr. Langley, Patricia's usually silent husband, nodded along uncomfortably, avoiding his wife's furious glare. By the end of the meeting, cracks were starting to form in the HOA's polished facade. Their iron grip on the neighborhood was slipping, and they knew it. As for me, I leaned back in my chair, munching on popcorn, knowing full well that this fight was far from over. But for the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand. The neighborhood began to feel like it was splitting right down the middle. Some people loved the tank, treating it like a quirky monument that gave Maplewood Lane some much-needed personality. Others hated it with a passion, acting as though its very presence was dragging the entire community into chaos. And then there were those who didn't know what to think. They'd glance at the tank, shake their heads, and mutter something about how things used to be simpler. Mrs. Langley wasn't about to let this go quietly. She called an emergency HOA meeting, sending out notices with language so formal it sounded like she was declaring war instead of discussing lawn ornaments. The subject line read, asterisk asterisk urgent. Community standards under threat asterisk asterisk. I couldn't help but laugh when I saw it. Under threat? From a tank? If anything, the real threat was her obsession with control. I showed up to the meeting armed with snacks, popcorn for me, cookies for goodwill, and took a seat near the back. The room buzzed with tension as neighbors filed in, some glaring at me, others giving shy smiles of support. Mrs. Langley stood at the front, her clipboard clutched tightly against her chest like armor. Her pearls gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and her lips were pressed into such a thin line they almost disappeared. Thank you all for coming, she began, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. We are here today because one homeowner has decided to disregard our guidelines in the most egregious way possible. She turned slightly, shooting me a look that could freeze lava. This Asterisk vehicle asterisk is not only unsightly but also disruptive to the harmony of our neighborhood. Harmony. There was that word again. As if painting everyone's houses the same color and policing flower pots somehow created peace and unity. I bit my tongue, letting her continue. This is not just about property values. It's about setting a precedent, she declared, pacing the room like a general rallying troops. If we allow this kind of behavior, where will it end? Will we tolerate tractors in driveways next? Airplanes on rooftops? Her dramatics earned a few murmurs of agreement, but not everyone was buying it. Mr. Thompson raised his hand slowly, drawing everyone's attention. With respect, Patricia, he said, his voice calm but firm, aren't we taking this a bit too far? A tank might be unusual, but it hasn't hurt anyone. Isn't it better to focus on bigger issues, like making sure everyone feels welcome here? Patricia blinked, clearly caught off guard. Before she could respond, Sarah, the young mom from down the street, spoke up. I agree with Mr. Thompson, she said, standing up nervously. I've lived here for 5 years, and honestly, I felt suffocated by these rules. My kids can't even ride their bikes without someone complaining about noise levels. Is that really what we want? To live in a place where everything has to be perfect all the time? The room erupted into murmurs. Some people nodded in agreement. Others looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. Even Mr. Langley seemed uneasy, avoiding his wife's piercing gaze. It was clear the tide was turning, or at least cracking. But Patricia wasn't ready to surrender. She slammed her clipboard onto the table, silencing the room with a loud thud. Enough, she snapped. This isn't a debate. The rules exist for a reason, and if we start bending them for every whim, we'll lose everything that makes this neighborhood special. Her words hung heavy in the air, but they didn't have the impact she hoped for. Instead of rallying support, they highlighted just how rigid and unreasonable she sounded. People exchanged glances, whispers filled the room, and for the first time, I saw doubt creeping into their expressions. Maybe perfection wasn't worth sacrificing individuality after all. As the meeting dragged on, it became clear that the HOA was losing ground. Not everyone agreed with me, but more and more people were starting to question whether the rules were serving the community or just controlling it. And as I left the meeting that night, munching on the last of my popcorn, I realized something important. The battle wasn't just about a truck or a tank anymore. It was about freedom, choice, and deciding what kind of neighborhood we wanted to live in. The HOA wasn't about to back down without a fight. If anything, they doubled down, throwing everything they had at me in an attempt to make the tank disappear. First came the fines. Outrageous ones. A notice appeared on my door one morning, detailing penalties for obstructing communal space, violating noise ordinances, and even potential safety hazards. Apparently, children climbing on the tank counted as a disturbance, and its sheer size was deemed a threat to emergency vehicles, even though no fire trucks or ambulances had ever struggled to get through our quiet cul-de-sac. But I didn't budge. Instead, I leaned into the chaos. I decorated the tank for every holiday, turning it into a bizarre centerpiece that drew even more attention. For Valentine's Day, I wrapped it in pink ribbons and stuck paper hearts on the turret. On Halloween, I covered it with fake cobwebs and placed a glowing jack-o'-lantern on top. By Christmas, it was strung with twinkling lights and crowned with a giant red bow. It became less of an eyesore and more of a neighborhood landmark, with kids begging their parents to stop by so they could take pictures. Local news stations caught wind of the story, dubbing me Tank Guy, and turning my little act of rebellion into a viral sensation. Reporters camped out on my lawn, interviewing neighbors and filming segments about suburban conformity versus personal freedom. One reporter asked me point-blank why I'd gone to such extremes. Because sometimes, I said with a shrug, you have to show people how ridiculous their rules are before they'll listen. Mrs. Langley looked like she was unraveling. Her perfectly styled hair seemed perpetually frazzled, her clipboard now bearing coffee stains from countless late-night meetings. Every time she saw me, she hissed something about consequences, but I just grinned and waved. Deep down, though, I couldn't shake the nagging question. How far was I really willing to take this? Was I prepared to lose my home over a tank? Over principle? The pressure mounted when the HOA threatened legal action, citing obscure clauses buried deep in the HOA agreement. They claimed the tank violated zoning laws and posed a risk to property values. Lawyers got involved, and suddenly, I found myself knee-deep in paperwork and consultations. The stress was real. I'd lie awake at night wondering if I'd pushed things too far. But then I'd think about all those years of feeling powerless against their endless demands, and my resolve hardened. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about standing up for everyone who'd been silenced by fear or frustration. In the midst of the chaos, something unexpected happened. Support poured in from unlikely places. Neighbors started leaving encouraging notes in my mailbox. Anonymous messages like asterisk, "We're rooting for you asterisk and asterisk. Keep fighting asterisk." Even Mr. Langley, Patricia's husband, approached me one evening while I was watering the flowers near the tank. He glanced around nervously before speaking. "Look, I know my wife can be difficult," he said quietly. "But what you're doing, it's making people think. And that's important." His words stayed with me long after he walked away. For the first time, I realized I wasn't alone in this fight. The tank wasn't just a symbol of defiance. It was a catalyst for change. Slowly but surely, cracks were forming in the HOA's iron grip, and beneath them lay a community yearning for balance, for rules that made sense instead of suffocating. As the battle raged on, I couldn't help but wonder, would they blink first? Or would I have to go all the way to prove my point? Either way, one thing was certain. The tank had ignited something bigger than any of us could have imagined. Just when I thought I was fighting this battle alone, an unexpected ally emerged. Sarah, the young mom who lived 2 doors down. She showed up at my house one evening, holding a tray of homemade brownies and looking nervous but determined. "I wanted to say thank you," she began, her voice soft but steady, "for standing up to them. I've been miserable here for years, but I never had the courage to speak out." Her words caught me off guard. Sarah was always so put together, the kind of person who hosted flawless birthday parties and kept her flower beds perfectly weeded. Beneath her polished exterior, though, was someone just as frustrated as I was. We sat on my porch, sharing stories about the absurdity of the HOA's demands. The time they fined her for painting her mailbox a shade of blue that wasn't approved, or how they sent her a warning because her Halloween decorations included a plastic skeleton dangling from a tree. "It's not just about the rules," she admitted, setting the tray of brownies aside. "It's about feeling like you can't be yourself here. Like everything has to fit into their idea of perfect, or you don't belong." Her confession hit home. Until now, I'd seen the HOA as an impersonal force, a machine designed to enforce conformity. But hearing Sarah talk made me realize it wasn't just about policies, it was about people. People who were tired of being told what color to paint their shutters or where to park their cars. People who wanted to live in a neighborhood that felt like a community, not a museum. By the next week, Sarah had organized a petition calling for reforms within the HOA. Dozens of signatures poured in, including some from unlikely sources. Even Mr. Langley signed it, though he refused to meet my gaze afterward. The message was clear. Change was overdue. The tipping point came during another heated HOA meeting. This time, the room was packed, not just with complainers, but with supporters. When Mrs. Langley tried to defend the rules, voices rose in protest. "Enough is enough," someone shouted. Another chimed in. "We're not asking for chaos. We're asking for balance." Mrs. Langley looked pale, clutching her clipboard like it was a lifeline. For once, her usual arguments fell flat. No amount of talk about property values or community standards could drown out the growing chorus of dissent. By the end of the meeting, the board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly realizing they were losing control. In the weeks that followed, negotiations began. Under mounting pressure, the HOA agreed to revise its guidelines. Trucks were officially allowed in driveways again, along with other common-sense changes. As part of the compromise, I agreed to remove the tank, which, honestly, was starting to smell like old metal and grass clippings anyway. On the day the tank rolled off my lawn, the entire neighborhood gathered to watch. Someone brought a grill, another popped open a case of soda, and soon it turned into an impromptu block party. For the first time in ages, laughter filled the air instead of tension. Mrs. Langley resigned shortly thereafter, retreating into obscurity. In her place, a new board took over, led by none other than Sarah. Under her leadership, Maplewood Lane slowly transformed into a real community rather than a Stepford Wives parody. As for me, I still park my truck in the driveway, proudly displaying its scratches and dents. To me, it's more than just a vehicle. It's a reminder that sometimes standing up for yourself is worth the fight. Because let's face it, nobody messes with Tank Guy. The day the tank finally rolled off my lawn felt like a turning point, not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood. It was surreal to watch such a massive machine being towed away, leaving behind flattened grass and deep tread marks that would take weeks to grow back. But as odd as it sounds, I wasn't sad to see it go. The tank had served its purpose. It had shaken things up, forced people to talk, and sparked a conversation that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. As promised, the HOA made significant changes to their guidelines. Trucks were officially allowed in driveways again, holiday decorations no longer required pre-approval, and flower pots could be any color you wanted, as long as they didn't block sidewalks. They even scrapped some of the more ridiculous rules, like the one about mailbox colors needing to match your house trim. For the first time in forever, Maplewood Lane started to feel less like a gated fortress of perfection and more like an actual neighborhood. Sarah took charge of the new HOA board, and she ran it completely differently from Mrs. Langley. Meetings became open forums where everyone's voice mattered, not just the loudest or most intimidating ones. She encouraged neighbors to share ideas, whether it was organizing community events or planting a shared garden at the end of the cul-de-sac. Slowly but surely, the tension melted away, replaced by laughter and connection. Mrs. Langley disappeared from public view almost overnight. Rumor had it she spent her days locked inside her house, polishing her collection of porcelain figurines and muttering about the good old days. Occasionally, I'd catch a glimpse of her peeking through her curtains, but she never approached me again. Part of me felt sorry for her. She'd built her identity around control, and now that control was gone. But another part of me knew this was better for everyone. My truck stayed parked proudly in the driveway, dents, scratches, and all. To anyone else, it might have looked like just another vehicle, but to me, it symbolized something bigger: resilience. Every scuff told a story of hard work. Every dent represented a battle won. And while I hoped I'd never have to fight the HOA again, I knew I wouldn't hesitate if I had to. Word spread beyond Maplewood Lane, too. Local newspapers wrote follow-up stories about how the Tank Guy incident had inspired other neighborhoods to rethink their own strict rules. People reached out to me online, sharing tales of their own struggles with overbearing HOAs and asking for advice. I didn't consider myself an expert, but I always told them the same thing. Stand your ground, find allies, and don't underestimate the power of humor. Sometimes, absurdity is the best weapon against absurdity. Life settled into a rhythm that felt real. Kids played basketball in the streets again without fear of getting fined for bouncing balls too loudly. Neighbors invited each other over for barbecues instead of keeping score on who had the tidiest lawn. Even Mr. Thompson, who used to keep to himself, started hosting weekly coffee hours on his porch. It was small stuff, sure, but it made a world of difference. Looking back, I realized the tank wasn't really the hero of the story. It was the people. By standing up for myself, I'd given others permission to do the same. Together, we'd turned a neighborhood ruled by fear into one driven by freedom and mutual respect. And so, life went on. My truck remained in the driveway, proudly unpolished and unapologetically mine. Because sometimes, the simplest acts of defiance can lead to the biggest changes. And if anyone ever tried to tell me otherwise, well, let's just say I still know a guy who rents tanks.